Long before the bombs fell, long before the empire burned, there was light, studio light, reflected from polished boots, banners, and faces filled with power. Hugo Jaeger had once believed in order, in symmetry, in the beauty of perfection. Born in 1900 in Bavaria, he came of age during the broken years of Weimar Germany, photographing parades, shopkeepers, and the new movement rising in the beer halls of Munich. By the late 1930s, his talent for color photography, still rare at the time, caught the attention of one man who understood the power of image better than anyone else. Adolf Hitler, Jaeger's photographs soon became part of the Reich's mythology. His lens captured the Führer not just as a man, but as a symbol, a demigod illuminated by torchlight, framed beneath colossal banners of red and black. He followed Hitler through rallies, motorcades, and triumphal processions from Berlin to Nuremberg. His Leica and Contax cameras became tools of propaganda, recording the spectacle that seduced millions. He wasn't just any photographer. He was the photographer, one of the few trusted to stand close enough to capture Hitler's private moments. Smiling, feeding his dog, greeting children, gazing into the horizon at Obersalzberg. Jaeger, unlike Heinrich Hoffmann, the official Reich photographer, preferred color film. Kodachrome and Agfacolor brought the Reich to life in hues the public never saw. To him, color revealed the truth of things. The shine of the steel, the dirt beneath the boots, the human exhaustion behind the grandeur. When he pressed the shutter, he wasn't thinking about politics. He was thinking about composition, about form, about light. But light can be a liar, and Jaeger's art was serving a machine that turned light into illusion. By 1943, the illusions began to crack. He traveled through ruined cities with his camera, photographing what the propaganda ministry didn't want shown. Burned-out tanks, widows standing over rubble, the empty eyes of soldiers returning from the Eastern Front. He began to sense what his images had helped conceal, that beneath the banners and the triumphs lay rot, hunger, and collapse. In secret, Jaeger began keeping negatives not for the ministry, but for himself, hidden in bread boxes, sewn into furniture, even buried in the ground near Munich. His color transparencies told another story, not of victory, but of ruin. He photographed people standing in ration lines, refugees trudging west with carts, the faces of slave laborers who stared at his camera in silence. By 1944, his relationship with the regime had cooled. He was still allowed near the Führer, but the magic had died. At the Wolf's Lair, he took one of his last portraits of Hitler, gaunt, shaking, pale beneath the bunker's light. Jaeger later told Life reporters that in that moment, the man looked already dead. His eyes were empty, and when Berlin began to burn, Jaeger followed his instinct, not his orders. He loaded his Leica one last time and drove toward the collapsing capital, not as a servant of propaganda, but as a witness of its undoing. He would photograph what no one wanted preserved, the death of the Reich itself. In April 1945, as Soviet artillery thundered across the horizon, he arrived in a city unrecognizable, reduced to dust and fire. Streets that had once carried banners now carried corpses, and through his viewfinder, the world he had helped glorify was ending frame by frame. He pressed the shutter anyway. Berlin, April 1945. The once proud capital of a 1,000-year Reich had become a skeletal ruin, a kingdom of ash echoing with the thunder of Soviet artillery. The Brandenburg Gate, once flanked by parades and banners, stood scarred by shells. Columns of smoke climbed higher than the Reich's own architecture ever had. Through this wasteland walked Hugo Jaeger, Leica in hand, moving with the detached instinct of a man who had spent a lifetime framing chaos within symmetry. But now, there was no symmetry, only collapse. He photographed everything the regime had once forbidden. The Reich Chancellery shattered and burning, SS officers shooting deserters in alleys, starving civilians crawling from cellars. His color slides captured the red-orange of fire reflected in puddles of oil, the pale blue of smoke rising above Tiergarten, the black silhouettes of dead horses rotting in the street. Jaeger was recording the end of a world that had once been obsessed with perfection. And somewhere between his camera and his conscience, he began to understand that he was photographing not just destruction, but judgment. He moved through Moabit, then Charlottenburg, photographing what remained of the civilian population. Mothers carrying buckets of water from shell holes, children scavenging bread from wrecked Wehrmacht trucks. He met a nurse, pale and trembling, who told him she'd been treating civilians crushed in air raid shelters. She asked who he was documenting this for. Jaeger replied softly, "For whoever survives." Each click of the shutter felt heavier. For years he had been the eye of the Reich. Now he was its witness, recording the punishment of its lies. He saw SS units still fighting. Boys with Panzerfausts and trembling hands, old men pressed into uniform. He photographed them too, knowing the negatives might cost him his life. In one courtyard, he watched an officer shoot a soldier accused of cowardice. Jaeger's hand trembled as he took the picture. Later, he would burn that particular negative, unable to keep it, yet unable to forget it. By night, he slept in the ruins of government buildings, his camera wrapped in his coat. The distant glow of fires painted the sky crimson. He wrote in his small notebook, the same one life journalists later discovered with his films, "The city is dying, but in the dying there is truth. The light shows everything now. No banners, no leaders, no speeches, only faces." The collapse of the Reich wasn't glorious. It was human, dirty, and unbearable. Jaeger's photos became silent confessions, the apology he could never speak aloud. On April 30th, the guns near the Reich Chancellery fell quiet for a moment. Rumors spread that Hitler was dead. Jaeger stood among the rubble, staring at the Führer bunker entrance. He raised his camera but didn't take the photo. He lowered it slowly. For the first time in 12 years, he realized he no longer wanted to capture that man. Not even in death. That night, under Soviet bombardment, he fled the city with his negatives, hundreds of color slides stuffed into his luggage. He knew if the Red Army found them, they'd see only a Nazi propagandist. If the Allies found them, they might see only evidence of guilt. To Jaeger, they were something else entirely. Proof that one man had seen the end with his own eyes and chose to remember. When dawn rose over the burning capital, it was no longer Berlin. It was a grave. The last banners of the Reich were smoldering in the gutters, and the streets were littered with papers, medals, and photographs fluttering like dying birds in the smoke. Hugo Jaeger packed his Leica, his color transparencies, and what little food he had left. He had no uniform, no protection, and no orders. He was a man with a camera, and 1,000 images that could get him killed. The road west was a gauntlet of broken columns and surrendering soldiers. Soviet tanks were moving in from the east, American divisions from the west. Between them lay a landscape of wandering ghosts, Wehrmacht deserters, starving civilians, and refugees dragging carts across the roads. Jaeger knew the Allies were capturing photographers and propagandists for interrogation. His work for Hitler's inner circle made him a marked man, yet he couldn't destroy his negatives. They were his only truth. He had documented the rise and fall, the myth and the ruin. To burn them would be to erase the only evidence that he had once seen clearly. He carried the film in tin containers, wrapped in cloth, hidden beneath bread and onions in his rucksack. As he moved south through Potsdam and into the countryside, he passed convoys of Wehrmacht stragglers, men still saluting the air, unable to accept that their Reich had fallen. At night, Jaeger slept in barns or under the open sky, sometimes photographing what he saw when it was safe. The faces of captured soldiers, refugees gathered around makeshift fires, a young woman clutching a burned family portrait. His film became darker, more personal, less historical record, more confession. He reached the small town of Ammersee near Munich by early May 1945. American tanks were already rolling through the villages. In one account recorded later by Life's editors, Jaeger described the moment when 2 U.S. soldiers searched his bag. They found the color transparencies and held them to the light. "I told them I was a photographer, not an officer," not SS. They laughed and said, "You took these for Hitler?" I nodded. One of them looked at the photos of Hitler smiling, waving, and spat. Then he handed them back and said, "Keep your souvenirs, Kraut." It was a moment of grace. Accidental, undeserved, but life-saving. Jaeger realized he couldn't risk another search. That night, he walked into a nearby field, carrying a metal canister filled with hundreds of color slides. He dug a hole near a deserted farmhouse and buried them beneath the soil. For the next 10 years, they would remain hidden, untouched, unseen, the buried memory of a regime that had tried to burn the world. When he later returned in 1955 to dig them up, the world had changed. Germany was divided, and the ruins had become history. But the color, the shocking, vivid color of those photos was still there. He opened the canister, unwrapped the film, and held it to the sunlight. There was Hitler. There were the parades, the rubble, the refugees. 12 years of illusion and 1 month of truth, preserved together in the same light. He had survived not by loyalty, but by seeing. And now he understood what his camera had truly captured. Not glory, not propaganda, but the cost of believing in them. The war had ended. But for Hugo Jaeger, the silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. Germany was no longer a nation. It was a scar. The rubble had been cleared from the streets, but it still lived inside people's minds, embedded deeper than stone or steel could hold. Jaeger returned to civilian life under a different name, working in photography again, but quietly, cautiously. He took portraits for small magazines and industrial firms. Nobody knew, or wanted to know, that he had once stood next to Adolf Hitler with a camera in his hand. In a Germany eager to rebuild, certain memories were best left buried. Yet every year, when spring came and the soil softened, he thought about the field near Ammersee where he had hidden his film. Those canisters lay there like a confession waiting to be unearthed. 400 color slides of the Third Reich's rise and ruin. He dreamed of them sometimes, reels of faces, uniforms, fires, and eyes. In those dreams, the colors were too vivid, too real. Finally, in 1955, 10 years after Germany's surrender, Jaeger returned to that field. The farmhouse was gone, overgrown with weeds. He found the spot by memory marked by an old birch tree. He began to dig. The shovel hit metal. The first canister came up rusted and cold. He opened it with trembling hands. Inside were the agfa-color transparencies, perfectly preserved, sealed tight against time. He held one up to the light. A photograph of Hitler greeting officers in Warsaw, 1939. Another, a Jewish ghetto street before liquidation. Another, German soldiers giving candy to children, unaware that death was only days away. They were all there, the world before and the world after. Light captured in its most dangerous form, memory. For a moment, Jaeger almost reburied them. He knew what they represented. Complicity, deception, beauty twisted into propaganda. But something in him resisted the silence. These were not trophies. They were evidence. He cleaned each slide by hand and sealed them again in new canisters. He stored them inside a safe, moving them several times over the years as he changed residences. He never exhibited them, never sold them. To friends, he spoke little of the war, but privately he began sorting through his images, labeling them with dates, places, names. Berlin, 1945. Hitler, Obersalzberg. Refugees, Munich Road. It was as if he were assembling his own indictment, not of others, but of himself. In the 1960s, Jaeger quietly contacted journalists who might handle his work responsibly. He feared the sensationalism that surrounded any relic of Hitler. He wanted the photos to speak truthfully, to show how ordinary people had believed, and how that belief had destroyed them. He eventually entrusted them to editors from Life magazine, the same American publication whose soldiers had once searched his bag. In 1970, the magazine publicly revealed Jaeger's archive for the first time. Over 1,000 color images of the Nazi years, meticulously preserved, shockingly vivid. Viewers were stunned. The photos didn't look like the black and white history people knew. They looked recent, immediate, disturbingly alive. They showed Hitler not as a distant monster, but as a living man among ordinary faces, a reminder that evil had once looked familiar. For the rest of his life, Jaeger never granted many interviews. He insisted he had been a photographer, not a believer. But the images told a more complicated truth, one where art and obedience had intertwined, and where seeing wasn't always understanding. When asked in his final interview whether he regretted taking those photos, he said quietly, "If I had not, they would have said it never looked like that." The truth must remain, even if it accuses me, too. He died in 1970, the same year the photos went public. His archive passed into history, not as redemption, but as record. The man who once glorified the Reich had ended by exposing its reality. When Life magazine first unveiled Hugo Jaeger's color photographs of Nazi Germany in March 1970, the world stopped for a moment. It wasn't because people hadn't seen the Third Reich before. They had seen it countless times, but never like this. Until then, the collective memory of the war was monochrome. Grainy black and white images had shaped the world's understanding of fascism. Distant, historical, almost abstract. But Jaeger's photographs shattered that distance. Suddenly the past was in color. Terrifyingly alive, painfully ordinary. Hitler's rallies were no longer sepia ghosts. They blazed with red flags and golden light. His speeches were no longer echoes in gray halls. They stood in crisp contrast against blue skies and polished uniforms. The Reich, which had once seemed like myth, now looked human, too human. Readers of Life were stunned. Letters flooded in. Some called Jaeger's work a revelation, others an obscenity. How could the same technology that captured weddings and birthdays also preserve the face of dictatorship? How could beauty coexist with such moral ruin? One critic wrote, "These images prove that evil does not look like a monster. It looks like us, smiling, organized, confident." The magazine editors knew they were dealing with something beyond journalism. Jaeger's archive was not just history, it was psychology. Each image raised uncomfortable questions. How could a nation fall in love with its own destruction? How does light, the essence of photography, also serve the darkest causes? In one photograph, Hitler stands on a balcony in Linz, waving to crowds bathed in afternoon sun. The color palette is beautiful. Soft blues, golden skin tones, warm reflections on glass. But in that perfection lies the horror, the seductive normalcy of evil. For many viewers, these images destroyed the illusion that the Nazi years belonged to another world. The faces in the crowd looked like neighbors, clerks, teachers. The uniforms looked tailored, the children clean, the flowers fresh. And that was the point. Fascism had never worn the face of chaos. It had worn the face of order. Historians later called Jaeger's archive the most unsettling gift to history. It didn't glorify, it reminded. It forced the world to look again at how easily people believe what they want to believe. How propaganda thrives not in lies alone, but in beauty. When asked why he had photographed Hitler so faithfully, Jaeger once answered, "Because I believed photography could make sense of power. I learned it only reveals it." After the publication, museums and historians from across the world requested access to his slides. Some of the images were used in documentaries and textbooks. Others were locked away, deemed too sensitive or too intimate. Color made everything too real. The smiles, the pride, the faith. But among the collection were also photographs of destruction. Munich in ruins, 1945. A skeleton of a city, color drained by ash. Civilians carrying furniture through collapsed streets. Children sitting beside the bodies of parents they would never again see. Jaeger had captured both sides, the rise and the ruin. His archive had become a mirror, reflecting what the German soul had endured and inflicted. The psychological impact was immense. Students, scholars, and survivors who saw the collection often described it as a second confrontation. a moment when history stopped being a lesson and became a wound again. For them, Jaeger's photographs were not just artifacts. They were proof that the past never truly fades. It only waits for color to return. By the late 20th century, when digital archives began to form, Jaeger's work was preserved by Time Life and later by Getty Images. Curators debated whether he should be called an accomplice or a witness, but perhaps he was both, a man who saw too much, too clearly, too late. In an interview note found among his papers after his death, Jaeger had written one unfinished line: "Light is never innocent," and that, in the end, was his epitaph, not carved in stone, but printed in color. When the Cold War settled over Europe, most of Nazi Germany's photographers disappeared into obscurity. But Hugo Jaeger's name kept resurfacing, quietly, uncomfortably, not because he sought fame, but because his work refused to die. By the 1980s, historians began revisiting Jaeger's archive through a new lens, not of propaganda, but of human psychology. His photographs, once seen as sterile documentation, were now dissected as a study of complicity. Each frame was evidence, not just of what had happened, but of how beautifully evil had learned to disguise itself. Film scholars at the University of Munich were among the first to digitize Jaeger's slides. They compared his compositions to Leni Riefenstahl's films. The same glorification of symmetry, color, and light. The same aesthetic seduction. But where Riefenstahl directed performance, Jaeger captured belief. His subjects weren't actors. They were believers, and that made his art far more dangerous. One historian wrote, "Riefenstahl choreographed fascism. Jaeger photographed its sincerity." In the decades that followed, Jaeger's archive became a cornerstone for visual studies in propaganda and mass persuasion. Universities used his color slides to teach how ideology infiltrates imagery. Museums displayed them beside wartime newsreels and survivor testimonies, not to balance the story, but to deepen it, to show that horror often begins in harmony. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, Der Spiegel published a retrospective titled "The Nazi in Color." The headline sparked outrage. Readers accused the magazine of sensationalism, of turning dictatorship into spectacle. But editors defended their choice. "We are not glorifying. We are remembering." In color, the debate revealed something profound. That history, when made vivid, still unsettled the living. People were not ready to see Hitler's Germany as ordinary, even though that ordinariness had been its power. Color stripped away excuses. It made the past immediate, intimate, undeniable. By the early 2000s, filmmakers began to draw from Jaeger's palette. In Downfall, 2004, Jojo Rabbit, 2019, and countless documentaries, the visual language of Nazi Germany shifted, from black and white horror to the deceptive warmth of color. It was Jaeger's influence, silently spreading through cinema. His photographs had changed how the world sees fascism, not as an ancient nightmare, but as a neighbor's smile turned wrong. At the same time, moral debate deepened. Was Hugo Jaeger an artist or a servant of tyranny? He had followed Hitler faithfully from 1936 to 1945, photographing rallies, parades, and military victories. He was not a resistor. He was part of the machine. But when the Reich collapsed, he didn't burn his photos. He hid them. And that act, historians argue, is what redeemed him. Not his loyalty, but his memory. In an age when truth is often rewritten, Jaeger's archive stands as a warning. History's danger lies not in what we forget, but in what we beautify. In 2010, Time magazine's digital release of his collection brought Jaeger to a new generation. Millions viewed the slides online. High-definition screens revived the texture of 1930s Germany, the sheen of polished boots, the saturated crimson of flags, the pale faces of spectators. Viewers scrolled in silence, the comments section filled with shock, confusion, and reflection. One comment read simply, "It looks like today." That was the final transformation of Jaeger's work, from history to mirror. His camera had captured a world believing itself eternal, and in doing so, revealed something timeless about power, faith, and delusion. Jaeger died in 1970, the same year his photographs were first published. He never saw how far his work would travel, but perhaps that was fitting. He had already lived through one collapse, and captured it frame by frame. In his last surviving note, found tucked inside a film canister, were 5 words written in fading ink: "Pictures outlive the victors." The world had moved on, cities rebuilt, governments reshaped. Children who had once lived in bombed-out streets grew old. Yet Hugo Jaeger's photographs remained, silent and unyielding. They were a witness that refused to fade. By the late 20th century, his slides had traveled from private collections to museums in Berlin, New York, and London. Scholars pored over them, not merely as records of events, but as lessons in human behavior. They showed that evil often wears a familiar face, that ordinary routines, parades, celebrations, and smiles can mask extraordinary crimes. Educators displayed Jaeger's work in classrooms. Students studied the images alongside survivor testimonies and archival documents. The color brought immediacy. A child's hand stretched for candy in the street, a soldier saluting with trembling resolve, smoke rising from the Reich chancellery as fires consumed the final symbols of power. These were not actors in a staged drama. They were the people who had lived it. Film directors, journalists, and curators turned repeatedly to Jaeger's archive. His work shaped the visual language of World War II in the 21st century. From documentaries to historical exhibits, the reality of Hitler's Germany could no longer be sanitized. Color forced the observer to reckon with the humanity of both perpetrators and victims, the complex truth that black and white history often hides. Yet for Jaeger himself, there was no redemption, no applause, no medals. He had taken orders, captured propaganda, and later chosen to preserve truth. His conscience was quiet, perhaps never fully satisfied, but his archive outlived him, teaching generations that observation carries responsibility. Modern historians describe Jaeger's work as an eternal witness, a record of the rise and fall, of power and collapse, of humanity entangled with its own hubris. His photographs are not meant to glorify, but to remind, to warn, to illuminate the fragility of order and the cost of obedience. As one curator wrote in 2015, Jaeger's slides are not history frozen in time. They are history alive, insisting that we see ourselves in the choices of the past. And so, Hugo Jaeger's Leica, his slides, and his careful preservation speak across decades. They testify not only to the Reich's collapse, but to the enduring power of the human eye, the witness who saw, recorded, and remembered when the world was burning. The war had ended decades earlier, yet the images remained. Hugo Jaeger was gone, his voice silenced, his presence only in the photographs he had left behind. But through those slides, the world could still see the rise, the deception, the collapse, and the faces caught in between. The Reich's power had vanished, but the evidence endured in color. For scholars, educators, and the curious observer, the photographs served as both warning and memory. They reminded the world that history is not abstract. It is lived moment by people who believe, obey, and sometimes resist. In museums, viewers stand in front of his slides and pause. They see Hitler smiling, children playing, soldiers marching, and then the destruction, the ruins, the human suffering that followed. The contrast is stark. Life and death, order and chaos, belief and disillusionment, captured not in black and white, but in the vivid hues of reality. Jaeger's archive has been digitized, reproduced, and studied endlessly, but the emotional weight remains unchanged. To see the color of the Reich's collapse is to confront the unsettling truth that ordinary human beings, living ordinary lives, can be complicit in extraordinary events. It is to understand that history's lessons are not only in the facts, but in the faces, the gestures, and the light that once illuminated them. For Hugo Jaeger, the camera had been a tool of power, a means of survival, and ultimately a vessel of truth. He witnessed history not from the shadows but through the lens, recording it for those who would come after. In preserving what many would have destroyed, he became the reluctant custodian of memory, a man who saw too clearly, but who gave the world the gift of seeing. 2. The war has ended. The Reich lies in ruins, but the images remain. Silent, eternal, and remembered by the only witness who never forgets: the eye behind the lens.